Yesterday, I went down to about 5-6 hour drive south of where I'm at in Southern Oregon, down into California to take a look at a tractor. I wound up purchasing it, and after barely letting go of the check as a guy tugged on it out of my hand. All right, maybe it wasn't that drastic. We sat and talked for a while, and we had some conversations, and headed on home. And as we're driving home, one of the things about the 5 between, let's say, Redding and Medford, and the 199 between Grants Pass and the Pacific Coast, is radio stations are not easy to come by. And if they do show up, they're usually Christian broadcasting in Spanish or classical music with, Mozart and all that going on. Your pop, your classic, your rock, whatever, probably not. And at one point while we're driving, we could get 2 stations. One of them is in a language I don't even think is Spanish. And the other one's a Christian station. So I decide, well, you know what? I got my wife a Bible for Christmas, got her name on it. She's been reading the Bible a lot, had a lot of questions. You know what? Good idea. Let's listen. And one of my favorite pastors, Raul Reese, this is R-I-E-S, Reese, not Raul Ruiz, the crazy commie congressman from the San Gorgonio Pass / desert area. And Raul Reese is talking about bitterness. And he says something, and so we listen to this whole thing, and he explains in his delivery that sin leads to bitterness. Sin leads to anger. Sin leads to these. And as he's going through the list of all of these attributes of people who are habitual sinners, going out of their way to rebel against God, rule of law, Constitution, and anything that's commonsensical, it really struck me that who he was describing was the political opposition to the Constitution. And, the cursing that comes out of your mouth leads to bitterness. And these words, cursing means, cursing of God. It's, internal with the heart, comes out external out of the mouth, but it comes from somewhere. The hatred, the diabolical desire to destroy a candidate like Trump, there's, no cause often. They don't have any they're and even the people they curse, their aim doesn't seem to even really tie into that person. It's a bigger hatred. It's a bigger problem. I mean, you're blessed by God to have this life, and yet to their own detriment, they are angry, they are bitter, they are cursing, they're throwing Biden against the wall and then throwing Kamala in instead or whatever. And these curses, they turn against themselves. And, and I'm talking, this cursing and bitterness of, your superiors. Defund the police. Defund, hate your teacher, hate your parents. Magistrates, the judicial system, if they don't agree with you, look how they attack the Supreme Court. Anybody in politics that doesn't, it's like an evil festering sore, and it creates bad consequences. Hang on. It attracts fellow creatures like them with their mouth being full of the cursing and the bitterness and all that. And what it does is it denotes the frequency of sin. You're not someone who's cursing if you're attempting at least to get right with God. I mean, none of us are perfect. I get that. But what we're seeing when you see that type of reaction, what it is it's a corruption of the heart. And that corruption, that bitterness, that hatred abundantly flows out of the mouth and out of their actions. And this is, kind of what I picked up on when I'm listening to Raw Reese. And I'm understanding, and I know a number of people in my life, and one of them is I'm not going to say who it is, but very closely related to me. I'm sure the two hosts know who I'm talking about, who epitomizes this. And we don't know why. We don't know where it comes from. It's because there's a corruption in the heart. It's because the mouth is the exit for all of that. And there's a saying about the corruption of the tongue, a sharp tongue, that the dangers of an evil tongue. There's sayings, there's scripture, and bitterness, resentful cynicism, intense antagonism or hostility towards others. And the Bible teaches us, we're supposed to get rid of our bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, malice, every form of malice. We're supposed to be kind and compassionate to one another. That does not mean to allow those that are out of control to walk all over you, but you forgive them. Forgiveness does not mean condoning it, but you're to forgive them as Christ forgave you, Ephesians 4:31-32. But this word bitter, which basically means sharp like an arrow or pungent to the taste, disagreeable, venomous, this idea of poisoning the world around them with their bitterness and their anger and their cursing. Bitterness is a mental and emotional state that corrodes or eats away at people. It can affect someone that might be experiencing profound grief, or anything that acts on the mind in the way of poison acts on the body. Bitterness is a state of mind that willfully holds on to angry feelings, ready to be offended by anything and everything, and able to break out in anger at any moment, and hate, or at least feel like they think they hate, those who they want to point their bitterness at. Of course, it's a state of not taking responsibility for your own actions, not being able to self-examine. If you can't self-examine, if you can't look in the mirror and say, wow, buddy, I don't know, man, you might have gone too far there or something like that. You can't do that. And I mean, in my youth, I couldn't do that. My wife and I talk about this often because our relationship has gotten better over the years, partly because both of us have learned how to self-examine. And the foremost danger in succumbing to a wicked heart and the corruption and the bitterness and the cursing and allow it to rule our hearts is that then our spirit refuses reconciliation, and then it begins to justify its wrongs. Just like you see in the lifestyle alphabet soup thing. They're justifying it. Deep down, we know what's wrong, right and wrong. We know what the rule of law is. We know what God's law is. God's law is written on our heart, according to the Bible. Bitterness leads to wrath, an explosion on the outside of the feelings on the inside. Unbridled wrath and anger, which leads to brawling, brash self-absorption of an angry person, narcissism, who needs to make everyone hear his grievance and it's everybody else's fault. Evil and another one brought by bitterness becomes slander, blasphemy against God, and slandering against men. And then it leads to a spirit of malice, which signifies evil-mindedness and feelings of intense hatred. This kind of attitude is devilish in its influences. Malice is a deliberate attempt to harm another person, maybe not physically, any way you can. Sound familiar when it comes to Donald Trump? Person who is bitter is resentful, cynical, harsh, cold, relentless, and unpleasant to be around. Any expression of these characteristics, well, that's a sin against God. It's a sin against your fellow man. It's unreasonable, and you can't reason with the unreasonable. It's something I've been saying for years. It is of the flesh, not of the spirit. And we need to see to it that we don't allow a bitter root to grow inside us. Causes trouble, defiles many. We may be wary of allowing bitter roots to grow in our hearts. We're even more wary of the bitter roots growing in the hearts of those around us. Sometimes our way of dealing with it is not to deal with those people at all, but sometimes it's got to be confronted. We are willed to live in peace with each other, working together, if we can, not in bitterness. Bitterness is like poison. It has to be removed. It has to be avoided. And therefore, we as constitutionalists and believers must watch diligently, be on guard against the dangers of bitterness, and be ready to take action when we can. When we look over the world, the divisions, the confusion, the war, disease, bloodshed, cruelties in the world, in the families we see anger and envy and jealousy and enmity and lack of love. And in individuals, sufferings of the body, tortures of the soul, sorrows of time, agonies of eternity. And we see these empty voids out there who have rejected truth with their cutting convictions, bitter reflections, stinging remorse, gloomy despondency, slavish fears, conflicts, deep depression, gloominess, foreboding feelings, soul-distressing fears, dark and dreary, distressful, painful, terrible world. Bitter, bitter, bitter. And that bitterness reaches into their heart. That bitterness reaches into their heart. That bitter root creates bitter words, bitter tempers, bitter actions, which make men miserable on earth, makes governments fall, and communities collapse. And for those of you who say, well, Doug, what's this got to do with anything? What it has to do with is you recognize it for what it is. You recognize that bitterness, that anger, that cursing out there that is reaching into the hearts of the world is wickedness. And we can't run from it. We can't hide inside the four walls of our church. We have to engage. We have to become familiar with it and stand against it and work to get rid of it. How do we get rid of it? We don't get rid of the people. We get rid of what's causing it. In other words, we need to get right with God. We need to get our church in gear. We need to get our pastors out there in the public square, and we need to get back to our Constitution. We need to get back on the right path. Right path destroys the root of bitterness. Oh, there'll always be the bitter people. There'll always be the sinful, bitter, angry, narcissistic, lashing out. They'll always exist. It's up to us to do what we can to not allow our sin to become anger and our anger to become rage and our rage to become bitterness. And for us to teach that same lesson. The root of bitterness, anger, grudges, whatever, will fail to obtain the grace of God. It springs up and it causes trouble. This is, I've told people for years, what we're in a battle over is individualism versus collectivism. And the collective is bitter. As individuals, we need to dismantle that bitter collective idea and attitude. Step one may have already happened. getting back to a Trump presidency and a Republican domination in Congress. When I say Republican, I mean good Republicans. I don't mean those rhinos. We may be on that road, but the festering anger still is there. The poison, the foulness, the root of the bitterness, the hatred of Trump and anybody who supports him, and the hatred of the Constitution, anybody who supports it, still out there. But I believe we may have turned a corner. I believe we may be headed in the right direction. I presume that while I don't believe we're totally secure, I don't believe that that enemy is completely defeated. I do believe that we have enough people now that are ready to fight, vigilant to fight for faith, fight for the Constitution, fight for Christ, fight for what's right, fight against the root of bitterness. And even if you only fit one or two of those things, good enough. Whatever it takes from a not bitter point of view, the right way to do these things. Because, bitterness becomes a doctrine. And everything that they do is rooted in bitterness. All the hatred. Ephesians 4:31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice.